What's up, guys? How we doing? Coach Klein, U.S. History 3, about to start a new chapter here on Vietnam, right? Chapter 30, Vietnam. I think it's got 5 sections in it. So it will be a pretty intense chapter. It's obviously one of the main topics that we cover in U.S. 3. So I want to give you guys a little perspective on some of the content you're going to look at and tell the story a little bit of how things originated initially in Vietnam for us to have any role there at all to begin with. So when we look at Vietnam, we think about Vietnam, we look at initially French control of Vietnam and their occupation of Vietnam from the late 1800s until World War II. And when we look at that, typically a country will look to occupy or control another country if the country that they're going to has something of value. It can be in the form of raw materials. It can be because of its location. It can be location could be like strategic location for the military or for trade. It could be for new markets for trade. So there's going to be 2, 3, 4 different things that countries would look at and say, you know what, that's a country that has something of value that we want to try to exploit or take advantage of for their own profit. And for France, going into Vietnam, it was rubber and rice. Okay, so we look at those 2 raw materials, rubber and rice, and then we look at, again, access to new markets and access to ports. So France occupies Vietnam in the late 1800s. They do so because they can basically, find benefit from raw materials found in Vietnam, rice and rubber, as well as access to ports and access to new trade markets. And the French colonists who went there, they built plantations on peasant land so that they could exploit these raw materials. Obviously, most times, and we've seen this even in recent history, countries, the people that live there, the natives or the citizens, do not like foreign rule. They don't like to be occupied by other countries. And the Vietnamese were no different. Okay, the Vietnamese protested against French control. The French rulers came down hard on them. They restricted their civil liberties, their freedoms, their freedom of speech, their freedom of assembly. Anybody who spoke out against them would be jailed. So it was a pretty oppressive situation for the Vietnamese under their control. Opposition, though, continued to grow. Right, so the French, even when they had these things put in place to try to curb the rising resistance from the Vietnamese, the opposition continued to grow. And one of the main characters that we need to know for the opposition movement for Vietnam to protect themselves against foreign rule was Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a leader, initially the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, which was founded in 1930, and basically he would organize the different protests and stage revolts against the foreign rule to try, or the French rule to try to gain Vietnam's independence. As a result of that, the French put a bounty on Ho Chi Minh, and they condemned him to death. So Ho Chi Minh had to leave and flee Vietnam, yet he continued to orchestrate the opposition movement from the Soviet Union and then later in China. So this was late 1800s until World War II. World War II starts, the French leave, and Japan comes into Vietnam, and they're going to occupy Vietnam during World War II. Japan invades Vietnam 1940. They construct military bases there so that they can strike against the Allies in Southeast Asia. So Vietnam went from French control in the late 1800s to World War II. French leave, World War II, and now Japan is there. And during World War II, Japan is occupying Vietnam. World War II ends. Japan is defeated. They're defeated, and they are forced to leave Vietnam. So once the Japanese started occupying Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh came back a year later, and he organized a group called the Viet Minh. And the Viet Minh, their group, the organization was there basically to fight for Vietnam's independence and to make sure that no foreign rule came to Vietnam. So after World War II, Japan's forced to leave, and now the Viet Minh is set up, and there is no foreign country in Vietnam trying to occupy. The issue is that France has no interest in relinquishing its control of its former colonies. So after World War II, France is now going to come back into Vietnam, and that is what we see initially, the conflict that starts that gets the United States involved. So after World War II, the French want control of Vietnam again, They come back into Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh are in the north, and they are fighting against the French control, and the French were able to control some southern cities once they came back in after World War II. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of how we got involved, because obviously we're a huge ally of France. We are working under a time, during a time where communism and the expansion of communism is something that we're going to fight very hard against. We were very reluctant, especially initially, to get our military involved, but we did send money. We sent millions upon millions upon millions of dollars to France to help support their move against the Viet Minh and trying to get control of Vietnam again. A couple points here too, and that's really it. I mean, that gives you basically an understanding of where we're at when you start looking at Chapter 30 materials. Like, how did we get there? How did we get to a point where the United States was even involved in Vietnam and had anything to do there? So France occupies. World War II starts, they're out, Japan's in. World War II's over, Japan is now forced to leave. Ho Chi Minh is there with the Viet Minh, and they are setting up a organization that's going to fight for their independence against foreign rule. France wants to return into power after World War II, and they have financial backing from the United States in order to do that. But what we're going to find out as you go through Chapter 30 is that France is defeated, and now the United States is left holding the ball, right? We had defeats in other places where we didn't want to see communism expand, and we did not want communism to obviously expand here. One of the things you'll see in Chapter 30 is the concept of the domino theory, right? The domino theory is if one country, if one domino falls, they all fall. If one country in Southeast Asia, because they're close proximity to each other, if one becomes communist, then they'll all become communist. So France is defeated. The United States has spent millions upon millions upon millions of dollars trying to support them. They're out, and now the United States is left holding the ball. And what we see is Ho Chi Minh, who is in the north, and Ngo Dinh Diem, who becomes the leader of the Vietnamese in the south. And now the two of them are going to basically go at each other. They're supposed to have a free election so that the people of Vietnam can decide what their future will hold. That election is canceled because Diem was going to lose the election, and the Vietnamese people were going to choose Ho Chi Minh, and they were going to choose communism. So that's basically the beginning of the story and the beginning of the Chapter 30 and beginning of the unit. I will post all of the chapter notes onto Classroom. We will continue to do guided readings as individual exercises or assessments. We'll have a couple different assessments here for Vietnam because, again, it is a more involved unit. And then we'll look to do our presentations as our big formal assessments at the end. All right? If anybody has questions about anything, don't hesitate to reach out. Email me anytime. But I did want to give you guys a little bit background information on Vietnam because it's such a big unit, and I think it helps knowing the story a little bit of where it started, how was there a conflict there to begin with, and ultimately how the United States got involved. All right? Take care. Hope everybody's well. Talk to you soon.